Look at the front porch in Marion, Ohio, summer 1920. The handsome Ohio senator, the devoted wife beside him. America's most reassuring photograph. She arranged the photographers herself. That February, her husband had written a 31-page letter to another woman offering her $5,000 a year to stay quiet, and his infant daughter by a third woman was 3 months old in New Jersey. His party would soon buy a cruise. Florence Harding knew, and kept campaigning. What she did afterward with his papers is the part nobody planned. It started with a wedding her father refused to attend. That porch was not an accident of small-town charm. It was a strategy. Roughly 600,000 people came to Marion between June and November of 1920 to stand on the lawn of 380 Mount Vernon Avenue and listen to Warren Harding say almost nothing memorable in a very pleasant voice. The Republican National Committee reinforced the porch so it wouldn't collapse. Newsreel crews got sightlines. And the woman standing beside him, 5 years older, in her high collar and her pince-nez, was the one who decided which reporters got close, which photographs were taken, and when her husband stopped talking. She was very good at it. She was good at it because she had spent 30 years learning that if you don't control the version people see, someone else will. So go back to the beginning, because the marriage everybody remembers as a piece of Midwestern wallpaper started as something closer to a hostile acquisition. Florence Mabel Kling was born in Marion in August of 1860, the eldest child and only daughter of Amos Kling, who was on his way to becoming the richest man in the county, hardware, banking, real estate, land. Amos raised her the way ambitious men in that era sometimes raised a promising daughter when the sons disappointed them. He taught her to keep books. He took her to the bank. He taught her to handle a horse and to read a ledger, and by every surviving account he expected her to be competent, obedient, and permanently available. She was competent. The obedient part fell apart when she was 19. In 1880, she left with Henry DeWolf, a Marion boy from a comfortable family who was known around town, mainly for drinking. She called herself married. No record of that marriage has ever been found, and biographers have spent decades noting the gap. Carl Sferrazza Anthony, who wrote the fullest account of her life, treats the ceremony as undocumented. Her son Marshall was born in September of that year. Do the arithmetic yourself. Marion certainly did. DeWolf left her in December of 1882. She came back to Marion at 22 with a toddler and nothing. Her father's terms were simple. Come home, drop the DeWolf name, take Kling again, and be absorbed back into his household. She said no. She rented a room and gave piano lessons to other people's children for money, which in Marion in 1883 was a public announcement that Amos Kling's daughter had been cut off and was not coming back on his terms. She filed for separation in 1884. The divorce came through in 1886. Then came the arrangement that tells you almost everything about the family she grew up in. Amos would not support her raising Marshall. He would, however, take the boy outright and raise him as his own. She agreed. Her son grew up in her father's house, a few blocks away, as her father's project. That is the woman who later stood on the front porch smiling at photographers. Somebody who had already learned in her early 20s that money is not a comfort. It's a lever, and whoever holds it decides who keeps their child. Keep that in mind, because it explains a decision she made 35 years later that most people find inexplicable. Now, the other side of it. Warren Gamaliel Harding was born in November of 1865 in Blooming Grove, Ohio, the son of a farmer who later called himself a doctor. At 19, he and two friends bought the failing Marion Star for $300. He was tall, he was startlingly good-looking, he played the alto horn in the town band, he joined every lodge that would have him, and he was liked in a way that has almost no relationship to accomplishment. He was not a schemer. He was the opposite, a man who wanted, more than anything, for the room to approve of him. They met sometime around 1890. She was teaching piano to his younger sister. She was 30, divorced, living apart from her own child. He was 25 and running a newspaper that was barely solvent. Marion's version, repeated for decades, was that she chased him. That version came largely from people who did not like her, which is worth remembering, but she does not seem to have been passive about it, and he does not seem to have been in a hurry. Amos Kling was in a hurry. He was in a hurry to stop it. He told people in town out loud what he thought of Harding. He went further than insults. The most persistent story is that Kling revived and spread the rumor that had followed the Hardings out of Blooming Grove, that the family had black ancestry. That whisper had trailed Warren Harding since childhood. It surfaced again in 1920 when a Worcester College professor named William Estabrook Chancellor put it into a pamphlet that the government moved to suppress. It was never substantiated. What matters here is not whether it was true. What matters is that Harding grew up understanding that a rumor could not be argued with, only outlasted, and that the man circulating it about him was about to become his father-in-law. She married him anyway. Look at what each of them was actually buying. She was a divorced woman of 30 in a town where that was a permanent status, estranged from the only fortune she had access to, with a son she saw at her father's convenience. Harding offered her an exit that was hers, not her father's. He offered a business she could run and a man whose ambition was visible from across a room. He got the daughter of the richest man in Marion, which brought him exactly no money and a considerable amount of standing, and he got somebody who could read a balance sheet. They were married on July 8, 1891, in the front hall of the house he had designed on Mount Vernon Avenue. It was not grand, roughly 40 people, no Klings. Amos did not attend, did not send money, and by most accounts did not speak to his daughter for something close to 7 years afterward. So there was no dowry. There was a house. She had helped choose it, they lived in it their entire married life, and half a century of American political photography would happen on its porch. Hold on to the house. A few months after the wedding, she walked into the Marion Star office to help out at the circulation desk. She stayed 14 years. This is the part that got sanded down into a charming anecdote about a helpful wife, and it deserves better. She ran subscriptions and collections. She hired, organized, and disciplined the newsboys, one of whom, a Marion kid named Norman Thomas, grew up to run for president 6 times as a socialist and remembered her clearly. A friend later summarized her performance in 4 words: no pennies escaped her. The Star went from nearly dead to genuinely profitable. He was the face of it, the editorials, the handshakes, the Chamber of Commerce. She was the ledger. Whatever else this marriage was, it was, from the first year, a functioning firm with 2 partners and a clear division of labor. He called her the Duchess. People have found that affectionate for 100 years. It's also the sort of thing a man calls a woman who tells him what to do. The firm did well. He went to the Ohio Senate in 1899, and in 1903 the Republicans made him lieutenant governor. He was a placeholder candidate, put up because he was agreeable and photographed well, and he did the job the way he did everything, pleasantly, without friction. By then they had been married a dozen years. There were no children. There would not be. And then 1905 arrived, and did 2 things to this marriage in the same 12 months. The first was medical. Florence's chronic kidney disease turned acute, and it nearly killed her. A Marion homeopath named Charles Sawyer treated her, and she survived. And she never fully stopped being ill again. Sawyer stayed. He would follow them to Washington and eventually into the White House with a brigadier general's commission, which tells you something about what she thought she owed him. The second thing that happened in 1905 involved a house a short walk from theirs, and a woman the Hardings had vacationed in Europe with. A woman who had lost her young son the year before, and whose husband was away being treated for his own collapse. Her name was Carrie Phillips, and Warren Harding was about to start writing her letters. He wrote her something like 1,000 pages. We know that number because those letters exist, and because for 50 years almost nobody was allowed to read them. They sit now in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress, 240 items, digitized, free to anyone with a browser. Most of them are his. Some run past 40 pages. A good number are on United States Senate stationery, which is its own kind of statement. They are not coy. Harding wrote to Carrie Phillips about her body and language that made a room full of Library of Congress historians visibly uncomfortable in 2014. He gave his own anatomy a nickname. He wrote poems. He wrote in a private code when he was worried about interception. And he worried about interception constantly. And he kept writing anyway. That is the first thing worth understanding about this man. He was a United States Senator conducting an affair with the wife of a close friend, both couples living in the same small town, and his instinct under that pressure was to generate the most incriminating paper trail in the history of American politics. And in 1913, 8 years into it, he wrote her this: "There isn't one iota of affection in my home relationship. It is merely existence, necessary for appearance's sake." Now, every married man having an affair says a version of that sentence. Historians have quoted it for a decade as though it settles something. It settles nothing except what he was willing to say to get what he wanted. and the same batch of letters shows him refusing, over and over, to actually leave. He would not divorce Florence. He said the illness made it impossible. He said the scandal would end him. Both were true, and both were also convenient. Here's what I can tell you about the marriage from behavior rather than from a love letter written to persuade somebody. In those same years, he took Florence to Bermuda and to Europe. He rode her from the road. When she was sick, and she was sick often, he stayed. And she went on running the political operation. Did she know? Several of her biographers conclude that she did, and that she knew relatively early that by around 1911, the thing was no longer a secret inside her own house. Carrie Phillips was not a stranger. The two couples had traveled to Europe together. Florence and Carrie sat in the same rooms in Marion for years. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when a woman decides that a humiliation is going to be survived rather than confronted, it looks like 15 years of continuing to appear at the same social functions. She stayed. She stayed and she pushed. In 1914, Ohio elected Harding to the United States Senate, and the Hardings moved to Washington, and he became, by common agreement, one of the least productive members of that body. He missed most of the roll calls. He liked poker, golf, and the Senate cloakroom. Florence liked Washington enormously. Then the affair collided with a world war. Carrie Phillips had spent long stretches in Berlin. Her daughter was educated there. She was openly, aggressively pro-German at a moment when that was becoming dangerous in America. And by 1917, she had come under federal surveillance. James Robinault, the Cleveland lawyer and historian who did the first serious study of the correspondence, raised the possibility that she was working for German interests. He is careful about it. The evidence is circumstantial, and her descendants reject the charge flatly. What is not in dispute is that she leaned on Harding hard to vote against war. She had leverage. She had the letters. In April 1917, he voted for the declaration of war anyway. That vote is the first hard proof of something the letters otherwise obscure. Harding was a weak man in the specific ways that got him remembered as weak. But when his public career sat on one side of the scale, and the woman he had been writing love poems to for 12 years sat on the other, he chose the career without much visible hesitation. He had already made that choice about his wife. Now, he had made it twice. By then, he had also started with somebody else. Nan Britton had grown up in Marion. Her father was a doctor who knew Harding. As a schoolgirl, she had papered her bedroom with his campaign posters, and her family knew it, and it was treated as a local joke. She was born in 1896, 31 years after he was. She turned up in New York after finishing secretarial school, wrote to him about finding work, and by her account, the relationship began in the summer of 1917 in a hotel in New York City. Her account is the only account. That is a real problem in a story where I have been telling you to trust documents, and for nearly 90 years it was the reason to dismiss her. Her daughter was born on October 22, 1919, in Asbury Park, New Jersey. Britton named her Elizabeth Ann. She said Harding never met the child, and that he sent money, $100, sometimes several $100s at a time, delivered by hand, some of it by a Secret Service agent named Jim Sloan. In August of 2015, Ancestry DNA compared samples from Britton's grandson and two of Harding's grandnephews and grandniece. Second cousins, 99.9%. Elizabeth Ann was Warren Harding's daughter and his only biological child, which means the woman who was called a degenerate and a pervert in print, who was accused of writing pornography for money, who had a book published to refute her and lived to be 94, was telling the truth about the central fact. That should adjust how much benefit of the doubt the Harding defenders get on everything else. Now hold both of these women in your head at once, because in the winter of 1920 they were both live threats, and Warren Harding was about to run for president. On February 2, 1920, he sat down and wrote Carrie Phillips a 31-page letter. It is in the Library of Congress. You can read it. He offered to quit. He wrote that to escape ruin in the eyes of the people who had trusted him in public life. He would, if she demanded it as the price, retire at the end of his term, never come back to Marion to live, and disappear into obscurity. And then, in the same letter, he made the counteroffer. If she thought he might be more useful holding public office, he would pay her $5,000 a year, every March, for as long as he stayed in public service. $5,000 in 1920. Call it $250,000 now, from a senator's salary. He closed by telling her the decision was hers. That is a sitting United States senator putting a price on his own silence in writing and handing the pen to the other party. He was not blackmailed into it. He proposed it. 4 months later, in Chicago, the Republican convention deadlocked, and in the small hours, the party bosses settled on the agreeable senator from Ohio. There is a story, told by participants afterward, and repeated ever since, that they asked Harding whether there was anything in his life that could disqualify him, and gave him 10 minutes alone to think about it, and that he came back and said no. Treat the 10 minutes as legend if you like. What happened next is not legend. Sometime after the nomination, Harding told party officials about Carrie Phillips, and told them she had the letters. The Republican National Committee handled it the way you would expect an organization to handle an asset, with a leak. Reported figures vary: $20,000 or $25,000, plus a monthly stipend. The historian David Pietrusha has put the total as high as $50,000. Add an extended tour of Asia and the Pacific. On September 23, 1920, Mr. and Mrs. James Phillips sailed for China, Hong Kong, and Japan. They reached San Francisco on January 18, 1921, 7 weeks before the inauguration. The Republican Party had become a third party to this marriage, and it had paid cash. Meanwhile, on that porch in Marion, Florence Harding worked the 1920 campaign like a woman who had run a newspaper circulation department for 14 years, which is exactly what she was. At the Chicago convention, she became the first candidate's wife to speak directly to the press on the record. She gave interviews, she learned the photographers' names, she stood with the newsreel men and told her husband when to stop talking. Asked about herself, she produced the line that got quoted for 100 years. She had only one real hobby, and it was her husband. That sentence has been read as devotion. Read it again as a job description. In August, the 19th Amendment was ratified. In November, she voted for him, the first woman in America to cast a ballot for her own husband for president. He took just over 60% of the popular vote, the largest share anyone had ever won. There's one more thing from that year, and it comes from a source I want to flag rather than hide. Evelyn Walsh McLean, heiress, owner of the Hope Diamond, Florence's closest friend in Washington, wrote in her 1936 memoir that Florence consulted a Washington astrologer named Marcia Champney, who told her that Harding would win the presidency and would not live to finish the term. McLean was writing years later, selling a book and describing a private conversation. Take it as what it is. Florence campaigned anyway. On March 4th, 1921, they moved into the White House. Within 30 months, he would be dead in a hotel room in San Francisco, and she would be standing in a house full of his papers with nobody left to stop her. The White House years look, from the outside, like the happiest stretch of the whole marriage. She threw open the grounds again, Wilson had closed them, and the gates and the lawn parties came back. She started a garden party for wounded veterans, and did it every year. She answered mail from strangers personally. Reporters got access no First Lady had given before, and they liked her. And she made sure they liked her. She was the first First Lady with a Secret Service detail, and the first to have a movie projector installed. Around Washington, she was simply the Duchess, and she leaned into it. Behind that, the two of them were, by most accounts, easier with each other than they had been in years. He'd say she was the one who got him there. She'd say something dry back. Guests noticed. Whatever the 1913 letter claimed, this was not two strangers. She also ran interference. She controlled who reached him. She kept Doc Sawyer close, now Brigadier General Sawyer, the Marion homeopath with a suite in the White House and an office in the War Department, which remains one of the stranger appointments in American history and was entirely her doing. When you have spent your adult life believing that access is power, you install the people who owe you. What she could not do was stop him. Nan Britton later described visiting him in the executive mansion and described a small coat closet off the anteroom near the cabinet room. Her account, again, is her own, but her account of the central fact turned out to be right, and in 1927 she published all of it in a book called The President's Daughter, after every publisher in New York refused it. She printed it herself. It sold more than 90,000 copies. She was destroyed for it. There was a third woman in the White House years too, or so the story goes, a young Marion woman, an alleged incident in a closet, Florence hammering on the door. That one comes down to us mostly through Gaston Means, who was a convicted swindler paid to invent things, and I'd leave it alone. Because the documented humiliation is worse, and quieter. He kept paying. The $5,000 a year he had promised Carrie Phillips in that 31-page letter, he paid it while he was president, every March. from the White House. A man occupying the office his wife had spent 30 years engineering, sending a woman in Marion, Ohio, a check to keep her from mailing the correspondence. And by 1923, the rest of it was surfacing. Charles Forbes had looted the Veterans Bureau. Jess Smith, the Attorney General's fixer, shot himself in May. Albert Fall had leased Teapot Dome. Harding told William Allen White that he had no trouble with his enemies. It was his goddamn friends who kept him walking the floor at night. To Nicholas Murray Butler, he said he was not fit for the office and never should have been there. In June, they left for Alaska. She was 52, one-kidneyed, and had nearly died again the previous September. Her doctors did not want her to go. She went. He was failing on the way back. On August 2, 1923, in the presidential suite of the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, Warren Harding died, almost certainly of a heart attack, at 57. Florence Harding refused an autopsy. That refusal launched a decade of poison rumors, most of them traceable to Means's 1930 book, which was ghostwritten by a woman named Mae Dixon Thacker, who publicly recanted the whole thing the following year. It is garbage, but the refusal itself was real, and it was the first decision she made as a widow, and it was a decision about the record. She sat up with his body on the train east. 9 million people stood along the tracks. He was, at the moment of his death, one of the most genuinely beloved presidents America had ever had. Then she went back to Marion, and she went through the paper. The legend says she burned everything. The legend is wrong, and the correction is more damning than the myth. She burned selectively. The archivist Kenneth Duckett laid it out in American Heritage in 1965 in an article titled, precisely, How Some Were Burned. She went through the files with Sawyer's help, sorted, destroyed some, and left the rest boxed. The White House private office files survived. Thousands of pieces stamped PPF, private and personal. She chose. She died on November 21, 1924, 15 months after her husband, of the kidney disease that had been killing her slowly since 1905. And she willed the papers and the house on Mount Vernon Avenue to the Harding Memorial Association. That is the move, not the fire, the bequest. The Memorial Association was Harding's Marion friends. They took the papers and they closed them. Not for a decade, for roughly 40 years. Researchers were told, in effect, that there was nothing to see, which the public reasonably interpreted as proof that there was everything to see. The papers finally opened at the Ohio Historical Society on April 26, 1964. And by then, nobody cared much, and the senatorial files for 1915 through early 1920 were missing anyway. Some of them turned up that July in the home of Sawyer's son. Now watch the timing, because it's almost funny. In 1956, Carrie Phillips, senile and out of money, was moved into a nursing home in Marion. Her court-appointed guardian, a lawyer named Don Williamson, went through her house and found a cardboard box in a closet. The letters. She died in 1960. Williamson kept them. In 1963, while the Memorial Association was finally releasing the presidential papers, Duckett got access to the Phillips letters and quietly microfilmed them. Francis Russell, writing the first honest Harding biography, had seen them. The Harding heirs sued. Duckett was made to surrender every copy. He kept one anyway and mailed it to the editor of American Heritage for safekeeping, writing that he had heard the words burn, destroy, and suppress so many times since acquiring the papers that he was taking extraordinary precautions. Russell's book came out in 1968 with the quotations stripped out. A probate judge sealed the originals. In 1972, the Harding family donated them to the Library of Congress under an agreement that locked the vault until July 29, 2014. They calculated that everyone who could be embarrassed would be dead. They were right about that, and wrong about everything else. On July 29, 2014, the library opened the box, digitized 1,000 pages, and put them on the internet. 13 months later, the DNA came back on Nan Britton. So here is what this marriage actually was. It was not a love story, and it was not a fraud. It was a firm. Two people who met when one had a failing newspaper, and the other had been cut off by her father, who built a business, then a career, then a presidency, and who divided the labor precisely. He was the product. She was the operations. He betrayed her continuously, and she never publicly acknowledged it once. He would not leave, and she would not either, and the reasons were not romantic. Divorce would have ended the enterprise, and the enterprise was the only thing either of them had made that worked. She lost. Understand that. The letters got out, the daughter was confirmed, the scandals defined him, and the man she spent her life installing is ranked at the bottom of nearly every list. The archive she curated did not save his reputation. But look at the porch again. Not the myth of it, the fact of it. That house was built by a 25-year-old newspaperman for a 30-year-old divorcee whose father wouldn't come to the wedding. It was the only property she ever got from that marriage, and she left it to be a museum. And it is the Harding home in Marion, open to the public. The porch restored, the same boards. She had learned at 22 that whoever controls the money controls whose child you keep. What she learned by 60 was the newspaper version of the same lesson. Whoever controls the paper controls the story. So she sorted it. She sealed it. She handed it to men who would sit on it for 40 years, and she chose the frame the country would look at. The frame held for 90 years. It held right up until a court order expired. Warren Harding wrote 1,000 pages to a woman in another house. Florence Harding wrote almost nothing, and kept the box and the address.